what's up?
You already know.
Good job.
You like the way I just kind of carry that
Yeah,
on?
I
I've
do.
been inspired. Sunday mornings, everybody's been getting into it. I love
It's
it.
true.
Let's go.
I do too. Me too. Hey, I don't know who's hosting this podcast and asking the questions and who's
Ashley, we
answering
just
them
both
today.
know that you are a better host than I am, but we can go back and forth.
Well, yeah, because we shared the message.
We did.
Yeah.
James chapter 3.
3. Yeah.
That's where we are.
Guys, we need to take a moment and just celebrate that we got through an entire chapter of James
Yeah.
in one message.
Yeah, it was tough, but we
Yeah.
did it. We did it.
Yeah,
So-
it's not going to keep happening, so don't get used to it. But
No.
we are 6 weeks in
Yep.
and just finished James chapter 3.
And James 3 starts really kind of with this conversation about the tongue
Mm-hmm.
and how it, although being a small part of the body, can put a forest on fire and stenches like the gates of hell. So Ashley, tell me a little bit about
Actually mixed
James's
up a little of
obsession.
Romans in
Yeah,
there.
a little bit. James's obsession with the tongue.
Yeah, well, I think James knows how much trouble we can get in when we don't control our tongue. And really what Jesus taught us is that out of what's in our heart, that's what we speak. So James is just warning us, and especially us, like he starts with a specific warning to teachers in the church to be careful what we say because it can have a whole lot of
Yeah.
impact.
The more I studied this week and the more we kind of talk back and forth, one of the things we just feel like James is almost reading the mail of this current climate and culture. Why do you think this passage is so pertinent, specifically with the dangers of the tongue in 2022?
I think there are a couple different reasons. One that, man, I feel like we're always beating up on social media. But here's the thing social media has done to us. It's made us think that everyone wants to hear our opinion about everything that ever happens. And then we're less careful about thinking through that before we're quick to fire it off, and instead of what would have been me maybe talking to a couple of my friends while I tried to figure out what I think about something, or even venting to a couple friends, becomes something that's out there in the open for anyone whose story I don't know, whose life situation I don't know, to read and then respond to in their heart or otherwise. So I think a lot of why it's so relevant now is that we all have these platforms kind of where if we're not careful about what we say, it goes way further than it would have 10, 15 years ago.
It's funny, I have a group of friends that, of course, are pastors and then have been surrounded by a group of people who either pastored in the past or have kind of been in church for a long time. And there's so many different opinions on the role of social media, but I think it's a bigger conversation because really the art of communication is really what James is talking about, right? Like the heart of communication, when James was writing this, really revolved around so many of the conversations that were happening face to face. So you had letters that were sent to the church, and so you have that form of communication, but even that was very specific to church community, right? So here's the letter to the church in Corinth, and here's the letter to the church in Ephesus. But really, the heart of it, James is saying, there's a face-to-face, really mouth-to-ear conversation that happens, and really his focus is there. Fast forward to 2022, and so much of our conversation is on this ethereal plane where I say something and I'm not sure who I'm affecting or who it's cutting.
Yeah.
And it becomes really, when we're able to separate the face and the names from the conversation, we become a little more laxed and somehow think, well, it's just social media. But really, we're finding more people are being cut deeply because of something someone said. And even as believers, I just, for a moment, before we jump off of social media, we got to be careful because we are potentially doing damage to the body because people think that because one person spoke, now they speak for everybody.
Right.
And that's becoming a little scary right now.
Well, I think even less malicious than that, if I'm having a conversation with you face to face, I can read some of your cues and how you're responding to something. And if I don't realize that I've touched on something that might trigger something that's happened in your past, or just might be an area where you're sensitive and nuance is required to navigate that, I can make that adjustment in real time. But if I post something about that and you just happen to be reading it, even though we have a relationship, that you lose that ability for nuance and to just see how people are responding. So it's not even like misrepresenting the body. I think sometimes we don't realize that we've hurt people that we actually love because we didn't have that opportunity to have the conversation face to face. We just put out our thoughts.
Yeah, when it comes to listening, which James reminded us of last week, a big part of listening is body language. A big part of listening is relationship. And if none of that's there, we risk being cutting for no reason.
Right.
And I will say, ultimately, I've never met a person whose mind was changed because of a Facebook post. But I've heard a lot of people who've been hurt.
My mind has been
because of it.
changed about someone by what they've posted on Facebook.
It's another story.
That's why I
for
got
another
off
day.
Facebook.
And social media as a whole. But really, the call to this passage is to consider those people that we talk to face to face. Now, he kind of really speaks to the dangers of the tongue. Can you kind of wrap that up? And,
Yeah, I mean, he basically talks about the power of the tongue to be such a small thing and have such a big impact. And the place where we kind of landed on Sunday was this idea of a wildfire, that it just takes one spark, and then before you know it, it gets out of control. And that can happen in several ways. I told a story it's really an incredible story about a little girl telling a lie that just ended up going on for decades and pulling all sorts of people in. So it can happen when we tell a lie, maybe for our own selfish benefit, but it can also happen if we say something in anger that we just aren't thinking about. And, especially sometimes it's the people you're closest to that what's going to hurt them the most. And in a moment where you're angry or hungry, which is usually my case, you might just say something and that you can apologize later, but it's hard to take back what you actually said. Can also be just an attitude of complaining and not doing things with joy, and then talking to other people about it, and before you know it, everyone around you has kind of been brought down by that grumbling and complaining. So there are a lot of ways that just this one small part can impact not just our own lives, but the people around us.
Yeah. Yeah, you talked about the fairy. That was a great story. The story of the fairies, that little girl who lied and on her deathbed kind of makes this declaration.
I mean, she was like in her 80s, but I don't think she was dying.
Oh, she wasn't that. Well, I mean, she was close enough, right? That's horrible. That's not what I meant at all. But so it led me to kind of two silly questions that may not be as silly. Number one being, what was the biggest lie you told as a little kid? Do you remember?
Oh my gosh, I do, because it ate me up inside. I stole a piece of bubble gum from this one piece, like a 5-cent piece of bubble gum from this kind of like drugstore milkshake counter place that was right below where I had ballet class. And it was a different mom who was driving us home. We stopped in because we were allowed to get like drinks or something. I wasn't allowed to get a piece of gum, but I wanted one, and I took it. And then my mom saw me chewing gum later that night, and I was like, oh, well, Mrs. So-and-so let me have it. And then later I could not sleep, so the next day I had to confess, I took the piece of bubble gum when I wasn't supposed to. And that just immediately comes to mind because it sounds so small. But as a 5-year-old, I was like, I can't believe I stole. And then I lied.
Biggest lie that you believed
Ooh.
that ended up hurting at the end?
I don't know.
It's a tough one, I know.
It is a tough one. I'm kind of a skeptical person, so nothing comes to mind right away, believe it or not, except for some of the big ones that I just don't want to say because,
I understand that.
keep the magic alive.
No, I just know that, for so many people, we remember as kids telling little lies, but I think the power of that story yesterday was how many people were damaged because of it. And I think for a lot of people coming to the conclusion that the lie they believed had cost them so much. And, sometimes that lie is about them, right? Sometimes the lie is about their history. Sometimes the lie is an identity that they've grabbed a hold of, only to hear that lie has been just that, a lie, it's life-changing for a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah. A story comes to mind, not about me personally, but in a study that I'm doing with one of my small groups, where there is a boy whose teacher said, "You'll never amount to anything," and something about that, just she was having a bad day. It just stuck with him for years. He ended up dropping out, and later on, it was totally like God just undid it in a moment in a job interview where they were like, he had aced this test, and we're just like, wow, you're really going to amount to something, and something about that switched. But
them, yeah.
But it is, we'll take on these thoughts that I'm not good enough for that, or that's out of reach, or I could never do that. A lot of times we hold on to those, and they are lies.
Yeah, it's funny because even when we did our study and considering adoption and so much so forth, one of the things we did was try to figure out how to navigate adoption, which is always tough with the child, how to communicate it. And this isn't a wrong or right, because there's been people on both sides of the argument, but there was a couple people we talked to, and one of the hardest things for them was finding out that they were adopted at 30 years old, at 25 years old, and really feeling like they had been lied to the whole time. And it just set a flame to a lot of their history and heritage, and they're in that place where they're like, well, then who am I?
Yeah.
And it's
who can I
tough. And who
trust?
can I trust? Now, again, that's not a advocate.
yeah.
I'm not trying to advocate
Every
one way or another.
situation is different,
without
nuance.
a doubt. But to hear how one lie or what they felt was a lie could radically transform them moving forward.
Yeah, and so I feel like some of this kind of applies to what you came up and talked about. Will you just briefly, because we didn't actually get a chance to see this picture yesterday.
Yes.
And we're not going to see it right now, but talk a little bit about what happens after a forest fire.
Yeah, so normally after a forest fire, there, and specifically here in the United States over the last several years, there's been record forest fires. You're talking millions of acres that have been burnt. But honestly, there's also forest fires that have been set intentionally because it gives a chance for the forest to reset. So even if the whole forest has been burned, there's an opportunity on the other side of that burning to really see new life. And what I found interesting is the first thing that grows is usually the plants that were native to the area.
So fascinating.
So anything that wasn't native to the area, which kind of makes sense when you really think about it, because invasive species have to be brought in, right? But the species of plants that actually were supposed to be there thrive when all competition is eliminated. They're the first ones to kind of come back. And because those type of plants are formed, there's a certain type of bug that is native to the area that, of course, thrives, which then brings birds that are native to the area that thrive off of the bugs that are kind of fat and juicy because of the nature of what's around. And you hear phenomenal stories of whole populations of like owls that return and kind of flourish because some of their predators are gone, a lot of the competition that wasn't natural to the area. And all that to say that even after a fire, there's hope for new birth. And literally, James goes right into that, and he kind of ends that passage, chapter 3, talking about those who are peacemakers and committed to peace, to being peacemakers, can sow seeds of righteousness and see a righteous harvest on the other side of that fire. So really, that's kind of the hope of the church, where if our tongues positioned in the wrong way can set a forest on fire, then through establishing a life in Jesus and allowing our tongue to be motivated by a perfect wisdom that he places in pure wisdom that he places in us, that we're able to reap the type of harvest that sets things right again, and what people have been longing for can return even after years of devastating words.
I think it's so beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful illustration, even if you didn't get to the part about like it being the native plants that come back and the native animals that come back, because there's something in that about who we were created to be.
Absolutely.
Our ultimate identity, our ultimate purpose as followers of Jesus that's still there. And so I feel like there are kind of two takeaways from what we talked about. That one is for those of us, which honestly is probably everyone in some way or another who have felt a little bit like we've been ravaged by that fire, that someone said something, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, but we just held on to that lie, that there's hope that God can set that right and can really like reset all of that into who we were actually made to be. Which is, it's a beautiful picture.
And I've seen it over and over again. The moment you're able to kind of identify and break the hold of those words that really have set so much on fire, you're only left with the identity you have in Christ. And it's not fast, but it's strong, which again comes back to this idea that we keep
like the tree
communicating.
growing out of a rock.
Yeah. But really, when we figure out our identity in Christ, sometimes it takes a while to just figure out the strengths and the giftings and His mercy and love for us, His hope for us. But if we can do the work of that, what's on the other side is an identity that's rooted in Him, and when it's rooted in Him, it's not swayed, so the fires don't rage like they did before.
Yeah. And then the other response, which you kind of hit on already, really to me goes back to a proverb you shared earlier in this series on James, that there's power of life and death in the tongue. And so we can choose whatever we've done in the past to really humble ourselves, submit to the Lord, ask for that perfect wisdom, and then we can be able to reap a harvest and use our words as a way to build people up and bring life, which is so cool.
Yeah, and if James was sitting here, I think he would remind us all that only works when you're first slow to listen, which again was last or 2 weeks ago.
Quick to listen.
Quick to listen. I did it again.
I know,
Darn.
I do it too.
But when we're quick to listen, it sets our heart in the right place. And when our heart's set in the right place, then our tongue can bring life versus being quick to speak and setting a bunch of sparks.
Yeah. So I'm putting you totally on the spot, but if we were to do a challenge for the Center City family this week around controlling the tongue, what would that challenge be?
I would say, first of all, notice when it's time to control the tongue, because I think that's really a discipline that needs to grow. And I would say even journal the situation down a little bit. I think you might be curious to find that you'll quickly figure out what the motivation behind a loose tongue is. And you might be quick to realize that, well, there's some deeper issues that you have to struggle with. But then also on the flip side of that, I would say set your heart to at least encourage or bring life to 2-3 people this week. What does that look like? What does that sound like? Is that spending some intentional time with your kids and just, whether it's you've never done it before, sitting down next to them during a prayer time and speaking life over them, whether it's, randomly having coffee with a neighbor and just letting them know how much you appreciate how well they take care of their lawn, or how much, you appreciate the smile on their face every time you see them, or, that type of thing. I think if we can set our heart to encourage a couple of people this week, you might fall in love with bringing life.
That's awesome. So guys, do that. We would love to hear if you're doing that. So whether it's finding us on Sunday or even shooting an email to hello@centercity.church,
absolutely.
let us know how you do this week and paying attention and then using your words to encourage people. And we're diving into James 4 on Sunday.
James 4, and he's all over the place.
Yeah,
Again, he just
doesn't
kind of
slow down.
Nope, not at all. But it's been a lot of fun. It really has.
It really has been. So we will see you Sunday at 10 a.m.